Hello, and welcome to Cover to Cover. Biography is a hyena of an art, chewing up leftovers, mixing up bones. No great man or woman is safe from its gnawing teeth. This week we look at three such. Yet another biography of Evelyn Waugh. His son Oberon is here as a witness to the truth of it all. And an award-winning biography of the 18th century biographer of British birds and bees, Gilbert White, who wrote the much-loved Natural History of Selborne. And someone who's sensibly taken the precaution of getting in first and writing her own biography, the Nigerian novelist Buchi Emecheta. She'll join us later. Finally, we'll look at a book that tries to marry two unlikely bedfellows, poetry and painting. But will they manage to consummate their marriage? This week our guests are Oberon Waugh, the Maxwell Murdoch and Eddie Shah of Literary London, with his glossy magazine Literary Review, which has mysteriously trebled its readership since he took over the reins. Dr. Jeremy Cherfas, the BBC's own birds and bees man, with his programmes such as Zoo 2000 and What on Earth, which brings the strange and intimate doings of wildlife out of the woods and into the sitting rooms, and Geoffrey Bernard, whose closest contact with country life is the ploughman's lunch he has at the Coach and Horses in Soho. Geoffrey is scribe of the Spectator Low Life column, recently published in book form. Evelyn Waugh is possibly the most admired British novelist of this century. Waugh wrote better than anyone about the glitter of Mayfair, vile bodies, the crazy squalor of Fleet Street, the immortal Scoop, and the gilded halls and fountains of Brideshead. But does it help us to know that while Waugh was writing Vile Bodies, his first marriage was busting up? We've certainly been told about it often enough in all the previous definitive studies. So what does Martin Stannard's Evelyn Waugh, The Early Years, add to our understanding or even enjoyment of Waugh? Oberon, is this anything like your father?
Well, you see, this is only volume one. It's 560 pages. It only takes him up to 1939. And by coincidence, I was born in 1939, so in fact, just as I appear practically on the last page. So really, he's writing about somebody I only really know about, as any other student of Evelyn Waugh would know from having read about it, really. I was jolly interested in the book. You say, is there need for another? And I think it's disputable whether there was need for another. But the truth is that the last book, which was written by a very close friend of my father's, a lot of good stories in it and a lot of insights and all the rest of it, I don't think he possibly had enough time to do the amount of research which might have been done on the book. So it is, this is the first biography, the Sykes biography, which has got a lot of inaccuracies and a lot of lacunas, things missed out. Well, what Stannard's done in his conscientious way is to plod along behind Sykes and see all the people who are still alive and still got their wits about them, whom Sykes, for one reason or another, didn't see, and dot a lot of I's and cross a lot of T's. I don't know how useful it is, but I'd have thought for anybody who is really a student of the subject, it is quite useful in that he does tend to find out exactly where Evelyn Waugh was at any moment and what he was doing, which Sykes doesn't really do. Well,
he seems to be doing a lot at lots of moments that possibly you might not have realised. Were you fairly amazed at some of the sexual peccadilloes of your late father?
Well, not in the least, in fact, because Sykes' biography hinted at the most appalling things going on without ever spelling them out. Sykes was a great one for saying names should not and shall not be given, but it must be known that Waugh was behaving disgustingly, all the rest of it. Whereas Stannard sort of plods around behind him and actually spells it out. And
seems rather innocent now, doesn't it?
Well, quite innocent, I quite agree, yes. But one of the interviews he did was with Lady Betjeman, alas now dead too, like John Betjeman, my father, and everybody else involved. But Lady Betjeman told him that she was constantly upset by the sort of sexual advances of my father and said that she personally didn't find him at all attractive. And it's very odd that should suddenly appear now, because one of the last times I saw my father, we were talking about something entirely different. And I said something which he obviously misunderstood. And he turned to me and said, are you asking whether I ever had sexual intercourse with Lady Betjeman? And I said, well, no, but come on. And the answer is yes. So I don't know whether he's telling the truth or whether she is, and we'll never know now. And does it matter? I don't know whether it matters or not.
The question I'd like to ask you, which has really intrigued me from this biography, is that Stannard, for all his worthy information gathering, he doesn't seem to have the same sense of humour as Evelyn Waugh. So one wonders, why did he choose to write such an enormous book about a man whose main thing is a particular kind of waspish humour, which he doesn't share?
I know, nor does he really share any interest in the sort of upper classes, in the period or anything. He has got an awful lot of disqualifications, and he is, in fact, a good, conscientious, fair-minded, plodding Don. and he's done a splendid job on those terms. All the big fault is he doesn't understand about the jokes. Well, perhaps that's not needed because you read the books for that.
And have you ever been shocked by anything you've read about your father in biographies such as this? Has it ever taken you aback, some of the information that's come
No, not in the
forth?
least. No, not in the least. I don't think I'm very easily shocked, but nothing ever has.
But he was a very energetic hack, wasn't he? I mean, Jeff, you could be described as one of the best hacks in Fleet Street. How do you rate Waugh?
The funny thing that Stannard does with this book, I didn't like the idea of Evelyn Waugh as a person, but apart from the humour, there are flashes in this book of Evelyn Waugh actually being not such a nasty man as I thought, and there are moments of kindness and sympathy and understanding, and I didn't get them from the diaries and the letters as much as from this book, and I now think that he was a much nicer man than I thought. And also the thing I like very much about Evelyn Waugh, I fear his son has inherited this, is that a very healthy thing is that he is was quite right in thinking that 90% of the human race were a complete load of absolute idiots.
You say he was a great hack. In fact, it's only in his early years that he did any journalism at all. I don't think he was all that good with copy dates, nor, I might add, is Jeff. I've been waiting for an article for literary review from Jeff for the last 3 months, so I'm glad you bring that up. So I wouldn't really produce either of them as great hacks of our time.
It's an odd thing, but the doctors attending my mother after I was born actually had to confiscate Black Mischief because she kept popping stitches. That's my only connection with it.
Martin Stannard's Evelyn Waugh, The Early Years, is published by Dent. From one archetypal Englishman to another, the natural history of Selborne has struck a chord in the English breast for 200 years. If you'd been forced to go to the colonies, it and the Bible would have been the 2 books in your knapsack. It describes and draws in meticulous detail a rural heaven that is uniquely British. Hitherto, its author, Gilbert White, has been regarded as a simple, unworldly country curate, strangely obsessed with melons and birds. But Richard Maybe's biography of Gilbert White, this year's Whitbread Prize nominee, turns this quaint image on its head and shows him as a strange mixture of timidity and ambition. How did you get interested in him in the first place?
It was fairly fortuitous, my interest in the first case. I was actually invited to do an edition of his famous and one and only book, The Natural History of Selborne, about 10 years ago. And I must be quite honest and say that prior to that, I'd found him a terribly forbidding read. The book is famously a jumble of anecdotes and letters and bits of undigested notes and whatever. And until I was actually forced to get into that by virtue of doing an edition of it, they defeated me. But as soon as I did that, I began to see that there was something really quite remarkable compared to other 18th century writing coming out of that. And also, there was a curious magic being wrought by the fact of what Gilbert White left out. It's a very austere book in some ways. Very little about himself is given away. Not an enormous amount about the actual machinery of living in a village is given away. And in those gaps, there's enormous space for people to construct another mythology.
What is so wonderful about his writing? Tell me.
I think it's, there are 2 things, really. First, the way in which his attention to the natural world, his extraordinary curiosity and delight is actually reflected in the language he used, language of great detail. And the second is the way in which he lets his feelings about the natural world bubble up without actually explicitly stating them. This is a lovely passage about the swifts and how they whirl around the steeples early in May. If any person would watch these birds of a fine morning in May as they are sailing round at a great height from the ground, he would see every now and then one drop from the back of another, and both of them sink down together for many fathoms with a loud piercing shriek. This I take to be the juncture when the business of generation is carrying on. One of the American critics who wrote about the book in the early part of this century actually called The Natural History of Selborne a vision of Eden. And that really is over the top, but it's par for the course in terms of some of the remarks that were made. And I think that it does catch a little bit of that vision, not of a golden age, and there's absolutely nothing nostalgic about White's writing. It is all rooted absolutely in his present observations in Selborne. And what it conjures up is not not for him anyway, a world that's gone past, but a world that was actually unfolding, just being discovered by the the audacity of people in the 18th century who were asking questions about the natural world and asking questions about human beings' relationship with it. And there is always that sense of innovative discovery, of opening up new frontiers.
Jeremy, how well do you think maybe succeeded in conveying Gilbert White as a person who, in a sense, took one step ahead in civilization by increasing the empathy that man had with the natural world around him? Up till then in the 18th century, you sort of looked at birds and bees as something separate and you tore them to pieces and analysed them. But he obviously loved the wildlife.
He loved the wildlife, and more than anything else, he was terribly modern in that he loved to see it in place. And he saw it in place as an expression of God's design, but that was almost secondary, and I think Richard maybe has succeeded marvellously in showing how very modern Gilbert White was in his approach to nature, in his approach to natural history. I mean, there are, for myself, there are a couple of holes, but I mustn't criticise the book that he didn't write. I mean, I would love to know more about how the church was organised at that time. I don't know about livings and curacies and how you actually, these country parsons, how did they go about fulfilling their duties on the one hand, but never being there on the other? So there are holes that I would like to know about, but as a portrait of the natural historian, it's simply marvellous. It brings him to life.
The thing that disturbs me about Gilbert White is that I find the Natural History of Selborne and Mr. Mabie's book very wonderful, but there is nothing more claustrophobic to me than a small English village. He seems not to exist without Selborne. I mean, the obsession with swallows and house martins is fascinating, but I mean, 70 years talking to house martins all day strikes me as being slightly dull.
Well, maybe
fascinating as house martins are.
Some people might say that 70 years talking to people in pubs, Jeff, might be very dull to others, you see. He probably saw character, rich warp and woof of life in these house martins.
Even more so in the swifts.
Yes.
And there was a marvellous scientific paper just a few years back in Nature in which a current professor of ecology went down to Selborne and counted the swifts over the tower, and there were still 8 pairs, which is what there were throughout Gilbert White's time. The suggestion being that there has been even more stability to that particular little bit than we know about.
I think it could just come back to Geoffrey's point about being obsessed with Selborne. I think it's absolutely right. Of course, we don't know very much about how great a proportion of his life was spent talking to house martins, because he didn't write very much even to his relatives about other things, so they patently went on. But there's no doubt that he needed, to some extent, to suffer in Selborne. Yeah. He needed to be imprisoned. And I think it could be argued that it's a condition of all good local writers, people like John Clare, for instance, that they in some sense had the felt perception of being trapped in a place, and they had to write themselves out of it in some way.
This was part of the great obsession, I think, with swift swallows martins, was that for half the year there they were making the summer, and for half the year they vanished, and this was one of the great mysteries of the time.
No, everybody knew where they were. Shakespeare talks about temple haunting martins. Everybody knew they went to Upper Egypt and things.
North Africa, yeah.
Well, everybody knew it, and yet there was great scientific controversy over it, because a lot of discussion went into whether they slept under streams, in hollow banks, in the beech woods. People didn't, if they knew it, they wanted proof. They didn't simply want the word of the ancients on it. That's the spirit of White, I think, that comes out, is that he wasn't prepared to believe anybody on anything. He wanted to know for himself.
And he created this sense of empathy with living things. The way he talked about the tortoise, Timothy the tortoise, I found that very moving, in fact. And I stopped worrying about it. For the first part of the book, I was terribly worried because he couldn't find a wife. And I thought, he's so shy, and he has no sex appeal, and he's lonely, and he's not going. And yet, then you saw he'd put all his affection out into nature and into Timothy the tortoise. But do we read too much into his prose? Let me quote from your book, March the 4th. A smart frost and very strong sunshine all day. The bees work very briskly on the crocuses amidst the banks of snow. Now, is that so very wonderful?
I think it is, and I think it's delicious, and absolutely March the 4th. And it's very hard to find anything remotely like that from the middle of the 18th century elsewhere.
But Ron,
yes, I live in the country there, and I just know you've got to work a bit harder than that. You've got to get any writing out of the country. You can't just look at the bees and say the bees are making hay in the sun or something. They just won't do that, actually. No, I think it's fine, but I just think that David Attenborough does it much better. And I really enjoy his programmes with these strange lizards standing on one leg after the other. I absolutely love them, and really interesting. But I'm sorry to say, I'm just not a fan of Gilbert White's.
Well, we must move on now. From the tranquil woods of Selborne to the grit and grime of North London. Many people have asked Buchi Emecheta how a Nigerian woman could come to Britain and make a living writing books in a language that is not her first nor her second or third, but her fourth. Her autobiography, Head Above Water, gives some of the answers and fills in the gaps that we haven't already read about in novels such as Second Class Citizen, which I'm pleased to say I gave a rave review to 10 years ago in the Sunday Times. As with her novels, this book combines a longing for her lost African childhood with a cool-eyed assessment of modern Britain. Buchi, when did you first decide that when you grew up you wanted to be a storyteller?
Oh, when we used to go home. Home means the village. And then we had to listen to the old ladies tell stories about our historic past. The histories of the British Empire and what have you, we read in books. But the history of our immediate people, we had to get from these old ladies. And I felt they are very, very powerful. And I decided that when I grow up, I'm going to be like one of them.
And it was your big mother, wasn't it, that was the great storyteller? She used to tell you about Lolu and Burma.
Yes.
What was that story?
Oh, that of Lolu of Burma was that she used to tell us that any bad husband is always being kidnapped by a monster called Lolu and his friend Burma, because my father was actually conscripted into the army and I was a war baby. And that was, and each time they praise me, they give me a praise name. They'll say, Buchi, the daughter of the one who went to a place called Burma and killed a man called Hitler. And then she would start like that. And eventually I realized that Lord Lou of Burma was Lord Louis Mountbatten, and that Burma was a place and not a person. But as a child, as children, we were told that if you behave very badly, Lord Lou will take you and eat you up with his friend Burma.
And a lot of the boy children in the tribe were called after Adolf Hitler, weren't they?
Yes, my immediate brother was called Adolf Hitler because my people want him to be as strong as Hitler. I come from the Igbo tribe where people admire strength, and to them they felt, okay, Adolf Hitler was maybe bad, but they felt he was a very strong man.
The name you gave to children was very important. You write in your book here, I know many Igbo men in Europe and America who will never go home because they have failed to live up to the names given to them by their parents.
Yes. For instance, my father's name is Nwabudike. That means this child is a warrior. And I don't know why. Maybe that was why he was conscripted into the army. He still fought and died in Burma. And my own name is Onyebuchi. That means I couldn't care less whether you laugh at me for having a girl or not. So you are not my God. So maybe that's why I'm sort of semi-feminist or whatever, because I don't care, you know, what people think much. So I think we live up to the names given to you by your people, and somehow inside you don't want to let them down.
Names are destiny, really, in a
I
sense.
think they can be, yes, they can really be, because then you see the expectation of your parents, you know, when they had you.
But then when you came to the United Kingdom, and you'd heard wonderful things about United Kingdom all your life, hadn't you?
Yes.
And is that why you came? Because it was because you were doing quite well in Nigeria,
Yes.
weren't you?
Well, during that time, we thought United Kingdom was the kingdom of God. And then we were brought up with the old Christianity that you have to sell everything to go to the kingdom of God. But we came here wanting to really have a taste of the kingdom of God.
And when you came, you didn't actually find the kingdom of God, did you?
No, I think I put it in head above water and in second-class citizen that if I were Jesus, I would pass England by without leaving a blessing. Because I came on the 2nd of March, 1962, and I came to Liverpool. It was wet, it was cold, and it was dirty. And I was so disappointed. But, you know, like, I've sold everything. I couldn't go back.
Yes. But then your first novel that was published, In the Ditch, was all about those terrible first couple of years, wasn't it?
Yes, yes. The novel was set in North London, too, in the flats, and our first experience, that was my first experience in my whole life of really realizing that my color can be a problem. I never thought about color before until I came. It was then I realized a color can be a problem. And then we were very young. We had children.
You had 5 children under the age of...
Yes.
You were 22 or 23 with 5 children?
With 5 children, yes. So, I had them very close together and looking for accommodation and without job and no future and no hope of going back and going from street to street like the Piper in North London. It was a terrible time.
But then your husband burnt your first novel, didn't he?
Yes, yes. He thought I was aiming above my station. And the woman, especially Igbo woman, is supposed to be at home, docile, nice, and doing exactly what your husband told you to do. But I started writing a book because he felt, nursing a child then was not enough for me. So I had to write this book just to prove to him that I was not, how he put it was, or did you come to England to be a lady just washing nappies? So to prove to him that I was doing something nice, so I started writing a book. But he didn't like that very much, so he burned that book.
And that must have made you even more determined to go on as a writer, did it, Buchi?
Yes, that made me determined to go, and that made me determined to realize that that marriage was not going to last. Because as I said in the book, I said it meant like burning my child. And anybody who did that, I'll never forgive the person.
You don't really have much time for men anymore, do you?
No, not much. And they can be good, people you can use to listen to your conversation, but I'm not really keen on them, not anymore.
No, not after having your first manuscript burned and things
no,
like that.
No,
I
not
think
that.
would put you off men for life. But you saw education as the way out, didn't you? And you had been very well educated in your Methodist school in Nigeria. And then when you came over here, you got your degree in sociology, even though you failed the statistics thing.
Yes.
I thought you were very, very tough going back to do that a second time.
Well, there was nothing else to do. It was either to do that or perish. And don't forget, we had the education during the colonial period. I'm afraid we had the best because comparing to what my children now, where they had a few years ago in London, they still went to the good schools of Camden High, and St. Mary Leban Grammar. So they actually went to good grammar schools. But comparing to what they were giving, we had even better teachers in those days.
But sometimes you had jobs, for instance, that when you did social work, you worked for the 70s Club, and it put you into a very complicated situation because you were working with black boys, but who were uprooted and alienated, and you were trying to be firm with them, and you got into a lot of trouble with them then, didn't you?
Yes. I'm still in that situation where actually people call you middle-class black, and you want to help your fellow black people, and people look at you as if you're an Uncle Tom, you are betraying the cause or something like that. And it can be a very tricky situation. If you read the book and you find those boys actually threw some, sparklers and things to my face because they were so, they could take it from a white person telling them what to do, but not from me.
Jeff, you've written a wonderful column for years in The Spectator about low life, but in a way you chose your kind of low life. It's a bit different from Buchi's low life, isn't it, where she was sort of fell into it when she came over here. It's rather a different level.
Well, originally I didn't choose it. I read her book with great fascination because I was skint in Camden Town 10 years before Buchi, and I lived in a doss house there, Rowton House. And your book reminded me of all this, and I'm afraid it's why I found it a very depressing book, because I think in retrospect, although, your book is an epic, it's extraordinary, but in retrospect I think you ought to have a little bit more sense of humour, if that's possible, about what you went through, because it's just all ridiculous. I think people should be discouraged from writing. Far too many books are written, but I think your husband burning your manuscript is going over the top, I must say. And, I was very touched by your sending him £30 before you arrived in England for him to buy you a coat, and that he spent it on a suit for himself. Surprise, surprise. Are you really surprised?
And he gave you a coat that actually belonged to someone else.
For my neighbour, yes.
The thing that depresses me about you, because you haven't had enough fun. Your days off, one of them really depressed me. There was an evening where you said you you spent all evening in bed with a hot water bottle reading Woman's Own. And that is suicidal stuff. I mean, that's the end.
Well, Geoffrey's the sort of man that thinks an answer to the Maiden's
Yes.
Prayer is a man, you see, not a hot water bottle.
I don't think the answer to any prayer is the pursuit of writing and studying sociology. I mean, they're the most two awful targets I've
So
ever
true.
heard of.
Yes. Well, that was the way I used to relax, just pile.
I think you're the
woman's-
gutsiest woman I've ever come across. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
Thank you, Buchi. Head Above Water, Buchi Emecheta's autobiography, is published in paperback by Fontana. When I first glanced at this book, I couldn't really see the point of lumping poetry and painting together. Isn't good poetry meant to create its own images? But somehow these work. Sometimes the poem is the muse for the painting, sometimes the painting is the muse for the poem. How does everybody feel about this book? Will it make a good Christmas present? Did it turn anyone on?
Well, I loved the pictures, and I thought they loved. I thought time and again the poems didn't really quite measure up to them because they're so wretchedly prosaic. I'm sure that you could do an anthology of poems before 1900 or something, and on the same subject, and you'd have quite a decent book. But so many of the poems are, just written as by E.J. Thribb. I find it's quite offensive, really, to see these beautiful pictures and these idiotic poems attached to them.
What did you feel, Jeff, about it?
I thought there was an extremely good match, which involved a poem that I'd never read before by Vernon Scannell, who I think is a tremendously underrated poet, which goes with a sicket, and it is about a ghastly marriage, and 5 verses, instant recognition if you've been married 4 times like I have.
Well, I think when you're married, you have immediate ennui, even before the honeymoon, probably.
She's
Jeff.
staring at the bottom of... she spends the rest of her days... Can I just read the last verse?
Yes.
While she spends many hours looking in the bottoms of teacups, he reads much about association football and waits for the marvellous envelope to fall. Their eyes are strangers and they rarely speak. They did not expect this.
Lovely. But you don't think it's a form of snobbery, is it, that people who are very up on poetry and love poetry dearly and have for years can't bear to see it presented in this way, as if to people who know nothing about it, as if to make poetry easier for people?
That's not my feeling, because I don't read, and we use poetry in the literary review, and we have this extremely gifted and sensitive poetry editor who chooses it, but we just put it in according to the size. If you've got a hole in the magazine that size, we put in a poem. And I don't know whether anybody reads it or not, but I certainly don't.
Well, you can find Voices in the Gallery in both paperback and hardback, and it is published by Tate Gallery Publications. Thank you to my guests Selborne Waugh, Dr. Jeremy Cherfas and Geoffrey Bernard. The other books we talked about today were Evelyn Waugh, The Early Years by Martin Stannard, Richard Maybe's biography of Gilbert White, together with the Journals of Gilbert White, edited by Richard Maybe with Francesca Greenoak, and Buchi Emecheta's Head Above Water. Next week, Colin McCabe will be finding out about 2 bulwarks of Western civilization, the CIA and Frank Sinatra. Miles Copeland Sr., who worked with both, will be here to shed light on their mysterious doings. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time when I'll be suggesting a few good reads to see you safely over the Christmas period, and opening a can of literary worms by asking, what book should children be allowed to read? I look forward to seeing you then.